Order, order. Good afternoon and welcome to the first public oral evidence session of the House of Commons Procedure Committee in this Parliament. My name is Kat Smith and I'm the Member of Parliament for Lancaster and Wyre and Chair of the Procedure Committee. Today, my fellow committee members and I are delighted to be joined by the Leader of the House of Commons, the Right Honourable Lucy Powell MP. The Leader of the House of Commons is said to act as the government's representative in the House and as the House's representative in government and provides that pivotal link between the two. Given our focus on how the House of Commons procedures operate, there has historically been a very close relationship between this committee and the Leader, and we are certain this will continue in this Parliament. So good afternoon, Lucy. Before we start this afternoon's session, I'd be grateful if you could please introduce yourself for the record.
Yep, I'm Lucy Powell. I'm Leader of the House of Commons and MP for Manchester Central.
Thank you. As is traditional, the first question this afternoon comes from me. Lucy, what do you think the working relationship between the Modernisation Committee and the Procedural Committee should look like in practice?
Well, thanks very much, and thank you all very much for having me. It's my first Select Committee hearing, so it's a bit weird to be on the other side of these things, having spent many years as a member and now Chair of the Modernisation Committee. It's a really important question and a good question. We had a manifesto commitment to set up the Modernisation Committee because we'd seen over the last few years that there were things about the way in which Parliament works needed to change, particularly around restoring trust in Parliament and raising standards, looking at some of the culture and behaviour issues, as well as sort of how we do things and making Parliament really be the most effective it can be. And when the outside world is looking in, it lives up to that attention, which, by the way, I really think Parliament did on Friday, and I thought that was a really good moment for us, that the world really was looking in, and that was one of the most sort of respectful, considered and well-attended debates I think many of us have seen. Sir Christopher, honestly, doesn't respect the rules of the chamber at all, with having his mobile not on silent. So we set up before the election the idea of a modernisation committee to look at some of those broad areas. What I was really keen to do with that is that make sure we had a sort of overarching way in which we could look at some of those issues, because I had seen over the last Parliament many good reports coming from this committee, from the Standards Committee, from the House Commission and others that really just sat in abeyance for a very long time, because at the end of the day, unless the Leader of the House brings it forward as a motion to the floor of the House, then it doesn't progress. So I wanted a way that we could consider some of these issues as a whole House, on a cross-party basis, working with the committees that already exist in the House, not duplicating their work. The Procedures Committee is a really important, long-standing committee of this House that I really look forward to you doing some great detail work on some of these issues, but that could look at kind of things holistically, really work as a task and finish group, if you like, so that when recommendations are made by your committee or others, there's a place where I'm held to account for bringing those forward, and we can consider taking those forward and any sort of unintended consequences or other things. So the Modernisation Committee is absolutely not to replace the work of the Procedures Committee or the Standards Committee or any other committee, but to act as a sort of an additional player in the market, if you like, to speed things up and make sure that we actually have a way in which your recommendations and progress can be made, because I think progress does need to be made in how we, for this committee's point of view, sort of how we do things, how our procedures work, how some of our rules work, and how we use the time in the chamber as well, and the things that you consider. I think we need to make some more progress on that in the coming years, and I'm keen to do that.
Thank you, Minister. And when our committee makes recommendations, as I think we've kind of agreed already, we make some very good recommendations as a committee. Could you say more explicitly about what role you see the Modernisation Committee having when it comes to considering those recommendations, and what your attitude as Leader of the House would be towards seeing those recommendations potentially implemented?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm keen that we do that, and like I say, I think normally how these things would have worked is that the Procedures Committee would produce a report, sometime later, perhaps in a more timely way it could have done, the government would produce a response to that report and then decide which bits of it they did or didn't like and whether to take them forward or not. So I want us to make faster progress on those things, and the Modernisation Committee can help sort of hold me to account for that, as well as the rest of the House, but also just to consider those things quickly and hopefully get them brought forward where they need to be brought forward, and time made available to them. But also, I hope a sort of symbiotic relationship around some of the areas where we are finding that there's a lot of demand that relate to the Procedures Committee, for example, that this committee, obviously not compelled, not asked or anything like that, but we could work with this committee so that you look at some of the things that are coming up that the Modernisation Committee in general think we need to look at. You look at it, you come up with the recommendations, and then we just take them forward. And I'm hoping that we'll just get to a position where we can just agree and take them forward when you've done the work. If that's all right. Yeah.
Well, thank you. We are, as part of this committee, hoping to do quite a lot of work in this Parliament, so that's certainly music to my ears. As a Minister, this is the committee that you probably relate most closely to, and we're really grateful to have you so soon since the committee's been formed before us to give evidence today. Will you commit to being before this committee regularly to update us on progress?
As much as you want, as many times as you want, I'm here.
Thank you, Minister. And when it comes...
Lucy, please.
Oh, Lucy. I'm trying to keep it quite formal, but we'll go with Lucy then. And Lucy, do you, when it comes to government contemplating procedural changes throughout the remainder of this Parliament, is that something that you see yourself coming to this committee for advice on before the government proposes it? Absolutely.
I really want to emphasise, I want us to take the House with us. I want this to be a House issue that the government then sort of brings forward. Yeah, we could, on some of these issues, we could have come in and just sort of laid motions and changed the rules and done those things. In effect, we can put things on the order paper. We have a majority in Parliament. We could just in the Commons, not in the Lords, in the Commons, we could just do that. I didn't want to do that. I wanted, any changes that are made to be changes that have a lot of support, that are changes that can work, that changes that will last the test of time, that wouldn't have unintended consequences and that kind of thing. And I think that's why the work of this committee is so important, because you can take that view and have a look at things in a sort of detailed way that others can't. And that as leader of the House and chair of the Modernisation Committee, we can perhaps take that more global view about where some of the gaps are, or where some of the areas that we really do want to sort of make progress. Because I have this sort of funny job, really. I'm in government. I'm Parliament's voice in government. I'm the Commons voice in government around the cabinet table, and I'm really the government's voice in the Commons and in Parliament. And I take both of those roles incredibly seriously. I'm not just a voice of the government, if you like. I am the voice. I should be, and I want to be the voice of the House to government as well. And I need all your assistance in that.
Well, we appreciate you coming before the committee so early on, and I know my colleagues have lots of questions, so I'm going to hand over to Lee Pitcher, who's got a couple of questions as well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Chair, and thank you for joining us, Lucy.
It's a pleasure.
It just feels strange to call you Lucy, but we'll call you Lucy. You've mentioned gaps there that might exist, and you've mentioned processes and potential tweaks and changes to those. In terms of procedural reform specifically, what do you see as the government's main priorities during this Parliament?
Well, I think there's been some things early on that we've sort of moved, we've made some progress on, and I know you're going to look at in more detail as well. Things like around proxy voting, for example, which we brought in some changes recently because they were very immediate, and there were some gaps in the system around the current sort of baby leave, baby loss proxy, extending that further. There are some issues with the medical leave proxy, which your predecessor committee was going to look at in more detail, and I would really welcome that. So I think there were some smaller things, but they're very important to colleagues. But more broadly, I think this, I'd really welcome this committee looking at things like, when we mentioned Friday and the private members process, and there were sort of questions from colleagues about process. Actually, as I hoped, I thought the process on the day really lived up to the moment, and it wasn't sort of subject to some of the tricks of the trade that sometimes that can be. But I think previously this committee had looked closely at the private members bill process. I would welcome that. How we use the sort of parliamentary time, the Commons time available. Are we using that to its best effect in terms of the allocation of Westminster Hall, backbench business and so on? Because I want to ensure, and I know Sir Christopher shares my view in this, but I do want to ensure that there's proper time for scrutiny of government legislation, and that the role of backbenchers is an impactful and purposeful one. So I'd welcome views from this committee on some of those things. And then we've just done this broad call for views at the Modernisation Committee, which I never in a million years thought would be capturing this zeitgeist that it is, and there's a lot of interest in it, and it's sort of fostering a lot of views. But one of the themes, and Sir Chris was on that committee as well, one of the themes that's emerging is around not just colleagues but House staff and other people sort of looking for a bit more certainty in the day, in the week, in how we sort of do things in forward business. So again, one of the early things I've tried to do in this job is do recess dates in a long way in advance and that kind of thing. But I would welcome this committee looking at some of the issues around maybe how a bit more certainty might be able to be created for people around things like voting and debates and things like that.
And I do agree, it's made a huge difference on a Thursday morning when you go through the future recess dates. That absolutely has helped people to organise their lives as well. So thank you for that. Thank you.
We've been trying to do business a bit further in advance as well, where that's possible,
difference.
sort of 2 or 3 weeks instead of just the 1 week.
It is appreciated, that.
Thank you so much. James Asser.
Thank you, Chair. You've already touched on private members' bills, which is something this committee is picking up because we anticipated that following last week there would be interest in that. And one of the priorities you suggested in your memorandum to the Modernisation Committee was how parliamentary time is allocated to backbench business. I wonder if you could kind of outline to us what do you see as the right balance between providing enough time for scrutiny of government legislation but also time for debate on broader policy and local issues, especially given there are so many new members.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, I think that's something you can, hopefully you can look at as well. We currently have quite a bit of chamber time allocated to the Backbench Business Committee, and I'm a supporter of the Backbench Business Committee as a vehicle for backbenchers to sort of initiate and bring forward debates. But they've not, and I mean, that pattern is sort of continuing, they're not as well attended or as sort of popular as maybe the time allocation they're being given. Yet, let's take, for example, petition debates. They are some of the most watched debates in Parliament, because if you've signed a petition, then you kind of get notice of the debate happening. So after PMQs, it's often sort of petition debates, and they're sort of consigned to kind of Monday morning in Westminster Hall or whatever. So, and then, is there sufficient time? One of the things we've been trying to do, because we have a lot of statements and urgent questions on Mondays particularly, is not put big heavy pieces of government legislation on a Monday, because I mean I experienced that in the last session, for example, on the online safety bill. Second reading of that bill that had been anticipated for about 5 years was on a Monday night. Because of statements and new queues, it was less than 3 hours, 2.5 hours for that bill, and I just don't think that's acceptable. I think chunky pieces of government legislation should have proper time on the floor of the House so that people can scrutinise them and look into them. So I'd be really sort of receptive to views about that, and maybe private members' bills have a different slot in the week as well. But hoping that you'll consider some of these things for me.
We'd be happy to.
Thank you. Lee Dillon.
Yeah, lovely. Hi, Lucy. Leaden and from Newbury. So in terms of, you mentioned not doing to the House and sort of bringing it all along together. So how will you build and maintain that consensus across the House on procedural reforms?
Well, hopefully we'll proceed on consensus on some of these things. I mean, that's the idea. I'm not, hopefully we wouldn't divide sort of too often, but there may be people that don't agree with some of these things. And look, I think some things that a lot of colleagues have raised with me, and I'm sure have raised with all of you as members of this committee, some of those things are actually not procedural or about rules. Sometimes it's cultural things, transparency, letting people know what's going on, how the kind of whips work with the speaker, work in the chamber, those kind of things. Sometimes they're sort of cultural issues around slipping versus proxies. Sometimes that's a sort of cultural issue rather than a procedural issue. So, I think that's why we sort of need to look at things in the round and not just think about the rule changes. But yeah, I want to take the House with us. I've also made sure that we've really engaged with the smaller parties who often feel that they're not included on select committees and they're not on the modernisation committee. So we've had 3 sessions now in the modernisation committee with the smaller parties just about their sort of inputs, and that's been really interesting because their inputs are different to other people. Because let's say, for example, one of the things that the smaller parties struggle with is they don't have the whipping sort of arrangements and the relationship with the chair and the speaker in the chamber, for example. They're not necessarily in on the conversations on usual channels, so they're a bit more in the dark than even other colleagues about what's actually happening and when things are going to happen. So I think there's an interesting perspective there. So it's just about trying to be, and one of the reasons I wanted to do a modernisation committee as opposed to other means was it's more transparent. Our findings, our meetings are for public record. People know what's going on, because I found too often in the time that I've been an MP, these conversations go off into a dark room and then something comes out that's completely different than what went into the room, and I have no idea how that sort of happened. So I think it's just about putting some of that, making some of that a bit more transparent for people.
And so if there were motions on procedural reform, so what sort of guarantees could you give this committee in terms of making sure the House has got sufficient notice of any of those type of motions so the analysis can be done, and debate as well?
Well, I mean, obviously, there's been a few things we've had to do early on that we'd sort of do kind of quickly. I mean, there's loads of motions in my name today. I think most days there's motions on the order paper that are in my name, which are sort of technical, if you like, or setting up the liaison committee is today's one, which I'm just sort of required to do, if you like. So, but I think on the sort of bigger questions where we've kind of got changes, hopefully they will have all gone through anything procedural will have gone through the filter of this committee. And if that's not possible let's take the recent changes to proxy votes. It's something obviously had a conversation with Kat about, and we had an exchange of letters, and I know you discussed that there was a sort of time urgency to making some quick changes, notwithstanding that this committee is obviously going to do a proper look at the whole proxy vote thing, and that's absolutely as you should, and I look forward to seeing what you have to say about that. So I will try and always be as respectful as I can to this committee.
And then as a slight aside to that, but in terms of your role as the leader of the House, there's been a few occurrences since the general election where ministers have given statements in other places before announcing them in the chamber. So just from your position, how can you ensure that ministers are making those statements to the House first?
Well, good question, and that is an important part of my job. I want Parliament to be respected. I want announcements. I've been really clear with the Cabinet, with special advisors, with ministers, in writing, orally and in other ways, that we do expect announcements to be made in the House first. Obviously, where that's not possible, where the House isn't sitting, let's say on a Friday or a weekend, obviously ministers should then make themselves available to the House at the first opportunity. We do live in a 24/7 media age, so people are on the radio in the morning and things like that. And I think we just need to get that balance right between trailing an announcement and then maybe the substantive being made to the Commons. But I think it's a really important part of being a minister is coming to the House and accounting for yourself with statements. And I'm very strongly of the view that ministers should be forthcoming with that. I think as of yesterday, we've had 54 oral statements in 49 sitting days, so we've done pretty well. But as you know, the Speaker takes a particularly dim view, as do I, when that's not adhered to. So we try and rectify that as much as we can. But rest assured, I am the person behind the scenes, sort of challenging that and making sure that happens as best as possible.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Lucy. And we've got a few questions about the work of the Modernisation Committee, and my colleague Michael Wheeler is going to start us off with some questions on the Modernisation Committee.
Hello, Lucy. So the first one we've got is a concern raised regarding the 1997 to 20 modernisation committees was that they operated as a rubber stamping exercise for proposals that were already supported by the government. How will you ensure that the current incarnation, your incarnation of the Modernisation Committee, avoids such perceptions arising?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I think the early modernisation committee, which obviously I took the name from, had made some very quick progress actually early on of necessary things. So I think the first thing that 1997 they did was remove the need for top hats to be worn to make points of order, and then brought in. You probably regret that, don't you, Sir Christopher? Yes. Bring it back. But then some really important changes to programming and knives and putting programmes around, because up until that point and in that early phase of that government, a bit like they have in the Lords, there was no end to sort of government business, so votes would often come at 2, 3, 4 in the morning, and the House obviously sat different hours, longer hours, and all through till kind of 5 o'clock every Friday as well. So the kind of idea of being a constituency MP in that era was quite a different one to what it is today. So I think it made some early, some good early progress, but obviously it was then in existence for quite some time. So I don't know. There were things that came later, but there was the Wright report and other things that came along. So I'm not sure I would totally take the suggestion that it was just stuff that the government happened to want to do anyway. I think there were other inputs into that at the time, stuff that came from other committees and other outside organisations as well. But yeah, and this modernisation committee got a broader remit because we are looking at some issues around standards and culture and behaviour in a way that was very sort of procedural heavy, if you like. Yeah, I think I'm probably going to have the opposite problem, where I'm going to have to convince the government of doing some things that I think we need to do. But anyway, let's see.
Thank you. Well, I think that's a wonderful starting point to feed the other way. You've set out your ambition that the Modernisation Committee will operate as a clearinghouse, I think you said, that will draw on the work of a range of other committees. So I think you've touched on this partly, we're talking about us as a committee, but how do you envisage this working in practice across a range of committees?
Yeah, well, I mean, we'll have to sort of maybe slightly feel our way through, but I think what I'd like is, I'm here before this committee today, and we're discussing, some areas that you might consider as some of my priorities and that kind of thing. So we've got that symbiotic relationship. Whenever we are considering some procedural issues or other things like that at the Modernisation Committee, Kat, as the chair, will always be invited as a guest member. So we recently had Daniel Greenberg in, the Standards Commissioner, to talk to the committee about the standards landscape, and the chair of the Standards Committee came along to all of those sessions as a contributory member of that those considerations. And as I say, we're as sort of recipients to your work in that sense. But I mean, your reports are to the House, strictly speaking, and to me, but we'll kind of look at those, and hopefully, because we'll have worked together in some way along the way, we'll just agree with everything you say at those points. Looking at some of the issues that I think need to do. So, for example, we've got this big call for views out, and there are some things that have come through from that early on, which perhaps I hadn't foreseen, that would be much more are the work of this committee. So we'll obviously make sure that's all fed back to Kat for her to pick up some of those issues with you and think about how to take them forward. But or other committees, I mean, for example, accessibility. We've got more disabled MPs in this Parliament, I think, than we've ever had before. Physical and other kind of accessibility issues have been a real problem for some of our MPs and for staff working here. So maybe the Women's Inequality Committee, for example, might look at some of those, or there actually might be work where it's a couple of committees. So hopefully that helps.
Gurinder, I think you've got a few more questions on ModCom.
Yes, thank you, Chair. So the first one, and you've already started to touch on this earlier, regarding the call for views, and a question was about what were the early themes, and you've already touched on the certainty aspect been coming forward, and that's something we picked up and reflected in our work programme going forward. But are there any other themes that are currently developing?
Yes, so some issues that have been raised so far, and we are expecting a lot more to come in this next 2 weeks, so people have still got 2 weeks to put in. Hopefully colleagues know this, but there's an anonymous form that people can fill in, but it recognises your email address. So Christopher, for example, can't put in 25 because I know he likes to put in more than one. No, I'm joking. But so you could only put in one on that anonymous form, but you can put in a written submission as well, or instead. And if you don't want that to be public, you can say that in the correspondence. So we are expecting a lot more to come in. So some of the themes that have been coming through, which, as I say, are around sort of certainty issues, the issue of kind of how people are called in the chamber and having a bit more understanding of where they may or may not be called is definitely a very strong theme that has come through. Sitting hours, albeit diametrically opposed views on sitting hours. So I think sitting hours is probably not somewhere that we can sort of get any real consensus on, I would say, because it just totally depends on really the geography of where you're based. A lot of the time, what works for people. Quite a few procedural type of issues that might be of interest to this committee in the chamber as well. Wanting more time for proper scrutiny of legislation, that's quite a big, not just time for it, but the ability to and the procedures to do that. Voting, the time it takes for voting, that's come up quite a lot. Proxy votes, which obviously you're looking at. Prayers. Select committees. There's just some of the things that have initially come up, but we'll obviously produce a sort of full thing, and I'll share all of that with Kat, and what I'll probably do is invite Kat and the other select committee chairs that are relevant to the meeting where we sort of discuss some of that, to be honest, so that Kat can get a full readout. And you could take your dibs then, can't you?
It sounds like there's potentially quite a lot of work coming out of Modernisation Committee that Procedure Committee could be picking up on. 100%. Yeah, 100%. I mean, look, this is not, and there are, as I say, there are some quite important other issues around standards and outside interests and the kind of, further improvements to ICGS and other things that are perhaps only the Procedures Committee can look at one or two of those areas. The Modernisation Committee, because there isn't a committee that covers it, but anything procedural you really should look at first, in my opinion. Thank you, that's good to hear, Lucy.
In terms of that list of themes and stuff, will the Modernisation Committee look at what kind of, what is more of a priority than others?
Yeah, I think that's the idea is to sort of take that holistic view and to think about, well, what's sort of doable, what's important, how do some of those things fit in with each other, and try and sort of prioritise that, really, because otherwise it's just endless, isn't it?
Yeah.
And look, I think on these things, I am really conscious that our procedures have stood the test of time, and they're a really important part of our democracy. And we do have to make sure that they're fit for the 21st century and they're fit for the kind of parliament that we want to be. But you don't want to pull at a thread when you don't know what's on the end of that thread, really. So, I'm not a kind of let's just sort of change everything overnight type of person. I don't think that's the sort of best way to proceed. I think considered improvements that kind of meet a demand and a need, and that kind of will make us more effective, make the job of a backbencher more impactful, more certain, more purposeful, and reflect all the challenges and all the pressures, the current pressures on MPs now, which are different from what they were even a few years ago. But now, people do expect you to be more visible and present in the constituency and doing constituency things as well. Sorry, I'm taking too long. I'll be faster.
Next question, mine as well.
Sorry.
So just moving on to another aspect of the Modernisation Committee, and something you spoke about early on about, and in this meeting as well, about engagement with the smaller parties.
Yeah.
And you've also already referred to having 3 sessions with the smaller parties. So just further on that is how are you going to facilitate that engagement, but also the intention for it to be non-partisan and to reach consensus. How would you reach that balance between the views of the smaller parties and bigger parties?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's one of the other things that's changed as well, not just the role of the MPs, but the sort of makeup of the Commons as well. When a lot of our procedures were considered, we had really 2 parties, government and the opposition, and obviously now we have many other parties as well. And so I do think it's really important to hear from the smaller parties, and I found those sessions actually really interesting and enlightening. And so, for example, I think issues around sort of being called in the chamber are different for the smaller parties, because they don't have the whips necessarily sort of there on the bench to speak to the speaker to find out what's going on. If you're in a smaller party, you might be the spokesperson across a range of issues. So you have to be in the chamber a lot more, but then you're because you're speaking a lot, you're going lower and lower down the list, but you're actually representing a party. That balance. Obviously, geographically, the smaller parties are, because of the territorial, the Plaid and SNP and the Northern Ireland parties, they tend to be further away. So they definitely didn't want sort of 9 to 5 in London type sitting hours, for example. So, I think it's really important that we reflect not just how we consider as committees their views, but actually how our procedures probably now need to reflect. Some of them need to reflect the fact that there are now many more parties in the House of Commons than there used to be.
Yeah, I've got a final question on the Modernisation Committee from Sir Christopher.
Questioning yourself.
Lucy, thank you very much indeed for coming along and being so open and helpful. And I must say, one of your first wins, as far as I was concerned, was actually announcing the recess dates for the whole year. I mean, that was why we haven't been able to do that in the past. I don't understand.
Looking at next year already.
But as far as in the 97 Parliament, we had the Tony Wright Committee.
Yeah.
And the Tony Wright Committee made recommendations, one of which was carried forward and is still in place, which is the Backbench Business Committee. But the other recommendation he made, a more fundamental one and more troublesome from the government's perspective, was a Business of the House Committee, so that backbench members could be involved in helping decide on the allocation of time of business across the House. And I wonder whether you got a closed mind towards resurrecting that, but particularly in the context of the end-of-life bill which we discussed last Friday, because there's an enormous feeling across the House that this bill needs and deserves to have much more scrutiny then it will be able to have in the backbench processes, both in committee, but more important, at report stage, because there'll be the people on the committee will be being chosen probably this afternoon, but the report stage, with that amount of interest from the members, with 600 people voting, how can we deal with that really effectively in one day? And shouldn't the government be giving more time for that process? The Prime Minister's rejected that idea. I don't know whether you've been rejected it outright, but if we did have a Business of the House Committee, then I'm pretty certain that the Business of the House Committee would be saying, come on, government, this is an issue for the whole of Parliament, and you've already referred to the esteem in which the House was held as a result of that debate last week. And people would be saying, well, what are we going to do to ensure that this really important piece of legislation is properly scrutinised and is not subject to arbitrary cut-offs? And I just wondered if you could help us on that, please.
Yeah, well, I think there's kind of 2 points in one there. So let me just take the sort of business committee sort of idea. I mean, obviously we do have business questions every they come around blooming quickly, I've got to say, every week for me, which are now quite lengthy sessions. I mean, everyone's getting in, an hour and a quarter, me on my own answering questions about the business of the house. So people do have that opportunity, but also I do think we should now have. I think now is the moment through this committee, working with modernisation committee, etc., to think about the allocation of time in the house in general terms, and I think that should be something that the whole house should be part of. I think on the sort of specifics of that bill. I mean, look, I think I said some of these things on the floor of the House. Lots of the questions that have been put to me about, let's say, that particular bill, I actually think are questions that are more general about legislation. I've said to quite a lot of colleagues over the last few weeks, if only we all gave that much attention and consideration to really quite major pieces of other legislation, which would be subject often to less time at second reading, less time at committee, and less time at report stage and third reading, and certainly attract far less attention and actual interest from colleagues across the House. And actually, it's been a good exercise in kind of people, especially new MPs, really understanding our legislative process full stop, really, rather than just the sort of private members' bill process. I think on that particular bill, as I said on the floor of the House, it is a kind of fairly rare occurrence where the government sets aside collective responsibility and doesn't take a view on a private member's bill. And you were around. You're the famed, person, kind of, whether you were wheeled out or whether you were self-propelled, who was able to use the perhaps not great procedures of private members' bills, that when a government really didn't want to just actually take a position, but they didn't want it to go through, could just run it out of time. And you were sort of, but actually, when the procedures and I don't think that's. I would rather we sort of said, look, government should actually either set aside collective responsibility on private members' bills or take a view on them, rather than do those kind of opaque tactics personally. But that bill, it had 5 and a bit hours at second reading because it was first on the list. It will now be in committee for as long as it wants to be in committee. Nobody else can push it out of committee. The first day that bill can come back for remaining stages and third reading is the 8th sitting Friday, which is the 25th of April. So that's the earliest. So in theory, it could be in committee for 3 months. It is going to take oral evidence. I think that's really good. And obviously I think it was the right review, or one of those reviews that so it was to take oral evidence at the start of bills, but didn't include that for private members' bills. I think it's good that it's going to do that. And I think giving it government time, I don't think is the right solution. That is a private member's bill where the government has set aside collective responsibility, because government time would be less time in this case. Government time would likely be less time, because what people are really talking about is committee of the whole house or something, which would be a lot less time than what it's actually going to get. And don't forget that our rules are quite clear about the makeup of the committee as well. So the makeup of the committee has to reflect not only the makeup of the parties of the house, so the usual proportions that this committee or other committees would have on party makeup, but it also has to reflect the views of the house on the bill itself. So those proportions, and that's a formula. It's not nothing you can get out of. So I don't know what the ratio is, but with the 330 to 275, that ratio has to be reflected in the bill. So actually think that our processes can work. I mean, on private members' bills, they can have games played with them and that kind of thing. But and I think that's something that the previous committee looked at in a report on private members' bills, which I would strongly advise you dust off and have a look at.
So just a quick supplementary. I mean, so the government is adamant that for this end-of-life bill, the 1 day for report stage will be sufficient, because obviously after that 1 day for report stage, if the report stage is not concluded, then it's most unlikely that there will be a further opportunity within the allocated time for private members to consider it further.
We potentially could have further time, but as I say, I think I think what we all saw on Friday was that the House wants to take a view. The House doesn't want to be denied the moment of actually sort of taking a view and things progressing. That would be the kind of worst case scenario of the world looking in, and we kind of, for procedural reasons, sort of don't take a view. I think there are lots of other ways that issue can be debated on the floor of the House. In the meantime, if the House wishes it to be so, for example, a further backbench business debate for the committee to consider further views made on the floor of the House or something. There are opportunities for the whole House to consider that further, and obviously there will be that further day at the end of April, and then what I imagine will be a reasonably sized and very balanced committee taking oral evidence and then considering it line by line. And as you know, and I'm sure you will take advantage of that, any member of the House can table amendments as long as they've got somebody on the committee to propose them and put them forward. So I would imagine that it will kind of be subject to quite a lot of debate. And as we've said, from a government point of view, we will, now that it's past second reading, we will work with the bill sponsor to make sure that the bill is operable and workable and is able to be implemented should the House wish it.
I think the Leader of the House for a very thorough answer on that particular private member's bill.
It's just it gets raised a lot, so it is worth just getting it all out there.
Absolutely. We have got some questions on proxy voting, which, as you're aware, we've launched an inquiry on as well. And Bambos Charalambos is going to get us started with some questions on proxy voting.
Thank you, Chair. And Lucy, you've alluded to this in your previous answers. So proxy voting was, the arrangements were introduced for serious long-term illness and injury as a pilot scheme in October 22, and they remain in force until the end of the last Parliament, and they've now been reinstated on a temporary basis. Our predecessor committee has recommended that they be made permanent. So I'd just like to ask from you what the government think still remain as issues in relation to the current operation of the scheme.
Yeah, well, I think the reason we didn't want to make it permanent at this point, because I hoped that your committee would consider the details of it further and the operation and sort of the scope and other things before we then made the scheme or any kind of scheme sort of permanent. So we've kind of got two, well, we've got a few different schemes now, but we've got two sort of main schemes for proxy votes. The baby leave scheme, which includes baby loss, miscarriage. It now includes complications in pregnancy, fertility treatment and other issues. And that scheme, people can, anybody who asks for a proxy can have a proxy automatically for 7 months or longer if they want to extend it, or they can bring it forward if they want to. And it doesn't require any paperwork, rightly so. You know, at that point in time, you don't want to have to go and get a doctor's letter or any of those things. That's sort of automatic. The ill health proxy has got specific, I think there have been some issues about that proxy scheme in the past. Both, some people have found it very hard to access because it's more subjective. Is their illness serious enough? Because it does say serious. Have they been able to get the right sort of paperwork and so on? And there is some subjectivity to it. I think there's also an issue about what it actually means, because for the baby loss scheme and everything else, that obviously, you know, people don't want to be on the estate and they want a proxy vote. With the ill health proxy, there's been some question marks around people perhaps being on an ill health proxy, but then also participating on the estate and doing things in the chamber as well. Now, there might be times that is reasonable, because somebody recovering from a very serious injury, sort of stroke or something, you know, could perhaps have a slow return to work. So I think I'd just like your committee to really explore that in depth. I don't really have a strong view, and I will just take your recommendations on that, to be honest.
And so just to go back a little bit on the first issue about the baby loss, the pregnancy leave, that's maternity leave. That was the first iteration of the, even that seems to be working fine. But the illness one, the serious illness or injury one, that's a bit more problematic in relation. Do you think it's the standing orders, or is it the operation of the scheme?
Possibly a bit of both. So, I mean, maybe that, I know, hopefully that's what you'll really kind of deep dive into. I think, you know, in the language in the scheme, it says serious illness, and then that can be a subjective kind of opinion on whether something is serious enough or whatever. And then perhaps in relation to operation. But I mean, in general, for me personally, I'm not a thin end of the wedger sort of person. I'm quite liberal on proxies. I think if people, is my own view, I think if people, for whatever reason, you know, can't be on the estate for long periods of time, or are transitioning, coming back into work or whatever, what's kind of wrong with them having a proxy? I think it's a more sort of transparent way, and it means that their vote still counts, and all of those reasons. But you know, I don't have a sort of strong view about that particular thing. I'm just really looking forward to you doing the work on it.
And just on that, I mean, you've talked about people that have got serious illness, but are still on the estate. So in the past, we used to have I forgot what it's called now, the nodding through process, where if you agreed with the other whips that the person was on the estate but not well enough to...
We still have that, actually, and that is still used as well, because that might just be on that particular day, you know, and you don't want to... I think, obviously, and you know, this is for you to consider, but the proxy vote system is perhaps more long-term, isn't it? So you're not going to be around for some period of time, and you want a proxy. We do have slipping, we do have nodding through, which might be used for, you know, a few days here, a few days there for other reasons, and the sort of pairing and slipping schemes as well. And yeah, and I think, you know, what we don't want... Am I allowed to say this at the committee? We don't want people taking the mick. I mean, I think that's sort of been the slight perception, but that I don't know if that's really happened. So I think you look into it, and I will take on board everything you say.
It's just that I remember a time when I think it was Tulip Siddiq. She'd just recently given birth, and she was unwell, and she had to be wheeled in a wheelchair to to vote. I think it was on a Brexit vote. It was something.
I remember it well. And I mean, look, that's one of the reasons that I kind of took the decision, talking to Kat about it, from a chair of the committee point of view. I wanted to plug some of the gaps in the baby leave proxy, because people have increasingly have sort of serious complications or complications in pregnancy that's not a miscarriage, but they're still pregnant and they just can't be on the estate, or difficult fertility treatment, for example, which if it's in their constituency and away from home, it just makes it difficult for them to be here. So I wanted to extend that for those, and I'm open to, if there are other examples that aren't covered, for you to sort of let me know about that. But as I say, I mean, I'm in the sort of forthcoming end of the debate on these things. I think in the past there's always been a bit of this is the thin end of the wedge problem. If we start giving people proxies, there'll be nobody here, and I just don't share that view particularly.
I'm sure that the Chair's indulgence is something that we'll look into with...
Yes, with gusto, I'm sure.
Absolutely.
Gusto from this committee. I think Graham Downey, you've got some questions as well on proxy voting?
Yeah, thank you very much, and thanks, Lucy, for coming along today. It's actually related to some of the items you've just brought up. So the new proxy arrangements for complications relating to pregnancy and extended absence for fertility treatment were brought in immediately as permanent rather than a pilot basis. Can you just outline maybe why the government decided to take that approach in that particular case?
Yeah, because I think it was a gap in that particular scheme, which was directly affecting some colleagues and had directly affected some colleagues, and I felt it just needed closing, that those gaps needed closing, and rather than establish a pilot or another temporary, I wanted to just make them equivalent immediately, so that people could take advantage of that where they needed to do.
I mean, just take back slightly to one of the points you were talking about before about the complications relating to pregnancy in particular. So someone with a condition such as hyperemesis, which is an incredibly difficult condition for a person to have, obviously, it can often result in quite a changeable condition. One day is good, next day is bad, or it changes over a period of months or indeed throughout pregnancy. Do you feel that the regulations at the moment would allow for someone with hyperemesis to make sure they were here when they could be here, but not be here when they're not, without feeling like they were constantly putting a proxy in and taking it away again, which I would imagine would make someone feel under quite a lot of pressure that they were failing or not to constantly doing that?
Yeah, is that a condition in pregnancy?
Yeah. So it's a sorry, I should have explained.
Sorry,
It's a condition where you can either be very sick or feel very sick, either for a short period of pregnancy or indeed throughout an entire pregnancy. It can lead to someone being bedbound for a number of months, sometimes needing hospital treatment, and it's a whole variety of conditions inside there. It's also incredibly hard to, or is very difficult to diagnose. So it's very difficult for a woman to be told you have hyperemesis. Quite often they're told you have bad morning sickness.
The good thing about that scheme is that there's you literally email the Public Bill Office and you say, I'm poorly with pregnancy, I need a proxy, and it's given to you. You don't have to provide any details for it, or even explain what that is, or even know that it's got a name. And you're given a proxy, no questions asked, and you can have that proxy for up to 7 months, or you can bring it forward. And I mean, it's not. Although the kind of broad understanding with a proxy is you wouldn't therefore be, around and participating in the chamber. You're not precluded from doing that. It just means that somebody else has got your vote for you for as long as that demands. So I think somebody who is struggling with pregnancy and is very ill with pregnancy, perhaps feeling under pressure to come be here and doesn't want to get slipped all the time and all of that kind of thing, I would probably advise that they just take a proxy and concentrate on growing the baby and doing other stuff that doesn't require them to have to sort of go through the voting lobby and their casework and tabling questions and writing to ministers and all the other things that you can do without necessarily having to be here to vote.
And I guess related to that as well is the role of the partners. Again, if someone's has a complication related to pregnancy such as that, or any of the other range of complications that might require a partner to be present, is that something that if the MP is the partner, that they could consider saying, would they be considered for a proxy in those circumstances?
It doesn't at the moment extend to that, no. But no.
And just
but you could still be. I mean, that might be kind of less ongoing. I think the point with proxies really is more that it would be for a chunk of quite a decent chunk of time, parental leave or whatever, which you can get it for. And we do have slipping and other ways in which people can not be here to vote, I suppose, if it was a day here and there.
Yeah, just making those procedures as simple as possible for both the person
it is,
affected, but also
again,
the partner
if
as
this
well.
committee identifies gaps in that, then please do let me know.
And just finally, so ahead of the introduction of those arrangements in particular, was any consideration given to comparatory statutory entitlements available to the public, so that MPs are not getting these kind of ways to not be at work that maybe others in the society might say that would be a helpful thing for us to consider as well?
Well, I think the key thing that I always sort of point out, I mean, we're never not at work. I mean, you know, being an MP is not a job. It's a way of life. It's a duty. We're office holders. We're nearly always working. I mean, I got elected when I was pregnant with my youngest, and I think I kind of came back to Parliament probably when he was 3 months old. But day 2 after having Tom, I had an HR issue in the constituency office. I had to go into the constituency office to deal with it. There was nobody else who could deal with that. And I took a 2-day-old baby with me. You know, we're never not working. It's just the nature of the voting and the kind of having to be here to indicate your physical presence, you know, at that point in time. I think in most other workplaces, people who were suffering complications with pregnancy, for example, or having ongoing difficult fertility treatment would be accommodated for that within their workplace, so that they could perhaps work on different tasks, work in different ways, work in a different location, take some time off and that kind of thing. So we just have a very peculiar aspect, especially to our voting being one of the kind of indicators of whether we're working or not, whether it is an indicator of whether we're working or not to be discussed, and the physical presence that's needed for you to actually do that, which I think is probably unusual for most other workplaces. And I don't think you could probably describe this as a workplace anyway, but anyway, that's a whole other debate.
Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Michael.
So to follow on from Graham and to pick up some questions on the technical point, but you'd expect nothing less from this committee, I suppose. The new proxy voting arrangements for absences related to fertility treatments sit within paragraph C of Standing Order number 39A, rather than as part of the arrangements for serious long-term illness,
it is, yeah,
or injury under paragraph D, or as an entirely new and separate paragraph. Do you think that this is the right place for them to sit?
I do, because one of the reasons, you know, the issue is that IVF treatment or complications in pregnancy basically have in the past been deemed as being not serious illnesses. So, you know, that's why I thought that was the much better place for those to be, so that those things weren't subjective or had a subjective opinion applied to them.
Okay, and to follow, are you satisfied that members' ability to self-certify their eligibility for a proxy vote has been applied appropriately across all the different circumstances covered by the scheme?
That particular bit of the scheme, or I think, because obviously the medical proxies are not self-certified in that sense. You do require quite a lot of sort of paperwork, and then there is there is sort of consideration given to allowing that, that's sort of governed by the Speaker's office. But I mean, you know, and it's not that the Speaker's being subjective. He's sort of trying to do that within the rules and the terms of the scheme. Yeah, I mean, if someone is saying they're having complications in pregnancy, or they're saying they've had a baby when they've not really had a baby, I'd be very, very surprised.
Thank you. And there are more. Sorry.
Yeah, no, it's okay.
So moving wider, are there any other situations not currently eligible for a proxy vote to which you think that the scheme should be extended?
Well, quite possibly, and I would only know those if people like you were looking into them, raised them with me, or other colleagues did. So, please do stress test that for me, if you wouldn't mind.
Okay. Happy to do the work.
Graham, it's you again.
You managed to do that.
I gave you a breather.
Oh, that's good, thank you. In the letter you sent to the committee on the 19th of November, you set out some of the changes that you wanted to be made to the proxy voting guidance, and there's just a couple of points we'd like to clarify around that.
God, now I've got to find that letter. Right, okay, remind me. Yeah, I've got it here somewhere. But,
so has the role of the Speaker in determining the length of a proxy vote in each of the circumstances allowed for under the scheme changed? And if so, what's the reasoning behind the change?
Under the medical proxy, I don't know if the time allowed has changed over time. But like I say, I think there's just been some issues with that in the past, which is why your predecessor committee was going to have a good look at it. So that I think, fair, transparent, open, and to my mind, actually erring on the side of granting and erring on the side of people having a proxy and being forthcoming, and a scheme being a scheme that is enabling people, not deterring people, I think is where you think you probably should head with it.
And I think you've covered this in an earlier answer to myself actually, but just to clarify on the record, so all proxy votes are now issued, are they automatically issued for 7 months, and then you can ask to extend it, or can you ask for 3? Or is it just
it's automatic for 7 under the baby leave, baby loss, under that provision, whichever paragraph Michael just said that was then, under that bit of the scheme. So it's automatic for 7. You can bring that forward if you want to, whenever you're ready to say, I don't need a proxy any longer, but you get it, everybody would get it automatically, no questions asked for 7 months, and they can extend it beyond that should they need to do so.
Okay, thank you.
We've got a few questions, Lucy, on written parliamentary questions, if that's okay. Yeah. Tracy, would you like to start off quickly with the... Tracy does have an SI committee to get through. One of the issues we have with procedural issues that Tracy does have to be on an SI committee at 12:30. So, so I'm bringing her in earlier than she's expecting.
Thank you. I'm just packing up to leave.
You can't be missing from an SI.
Our predecessor committee had looked at some numbers around written questions, and the sort of time that it takes in that can vary very different per session over and on a daily basis. And I was wondering what your thoughts were around whether you think there's adequate time to answer them in a proper and coherent way, what we would need to do to support that and look at that a little bit further. And how you in your role would be able to assist ministers and departments to deliver that work.
Look, I think timely and appropriately forthcoming answers to written parliamentary questions is incredibly important, and Parliament should expect that, and ministers should be doing that, and departments should be doing that. And I have written to all of the Cabinet and other ministers, and I have spoken to special advisors and others about that, and that being the expectation of the government that ministers and departments will answer PQs in a timely fashion, but in a fashion that gives the fullest information available, really. And I think the role that this committee performs in keeping a track of that, and the sort of league tables, and really looking at the performance of different departments is absolutely critical to the government. That I've used the last committee's report on that. I sent it round to all Cabinet colleagues for them to see where their department sat on those league tables, and asked them to take action to improve it in those cases. So I really hope that this committee will continue that work, because it's vital. Without the work of this committee on WPQs, I wouldn't be able to challenge ministers and others for not getting it right.
In terms of the quality of the responses, how do you see your role in supporting departments and the ministers and a lot of new staff, particularly with the new intake, to enable to do that? Is there a training programme or a way that we can actually make sure that quality is as good within the timescales?
Well, look, we have seen a real spike in written questions being tabled since there's so many new MPs. And I mean, what I would say is, I think we absolutely need to make sure that questions are answered well and answered in a timely way. And as I say, really are forthcoming with the information that they're providing. But in return, what I would say to sort of colleagues really is perhaps use them a bit more wisely and in not such a sort of repetitive way. There's lots of ways to raise issues with ministers. And so it sort of depends what kind of answer you want and what kind of outcome you want, either directly writing to ministers, raising issues in oral questions or in statements or in debates in Westminster Hall or initiating adjournment debates and all sorts of things. Because sometimes a written PQ isn't actually the way to raise the type of issue. I think written PQs are more when you want some factual information from a department that's not otherwise available, rather than necessarily to raise a particular case or a complicated policy situation or other things like that, which they have sometimes do get used for that as well. But there is training available, and it's something I get asked about, and I get asked about in business questions quite a lot when people haven't received right answers or when something's gone wrong with it. And I would encourage colleagues where things have gone wrong with it to raise it with me, and I will certainly raise it with departments as well.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
And I think, Frank, you've got some more questions on written questions.
Good luck with your SI.
Thank you.
Be scrutinising.
Got my glasses ready.
Thanks very much, Chair. I suppose just drilling down a little further on the answer to Tracy there, both, I suppose, linked to parliamentary written questions, but also to written correspondence with government departments. So, as you've highlighted there, Lucy, your part of your role as leader includes taking up sort of members' requests in these areas. I'm keen to get a sense. Do members regularly contact you around these issues? And I suppose, especially given that we have a range of new MPs, do you think that they understand how to do that?
I mean, certainly more experienced MPs have contacted me since the election about those issues quite a bit, both in business questions on the floor of the House or just, in the tea room, or emailing me or writing to me, or indeed PQing me about PQs, which has happened. So, yeah, I mean, I do say to new members, I've held a number of sessions for new members on how to make the most of Parliament, how to make impact in Parliament. I do talk to them about written parliamentary questions and correspondence. But yeah, and I think correspondence has got slower for some departments in recent months. And I don't think that's necessarily a ministerial thing. I think it's just a sort of, it's a kind of departments. We've now got a minister in the Cabinet Office who is overall sort of responsible for ministerial correspondence and keeping a track of some of that as well, which is a sort of new development, which is good. But yeah, I mean, I think please spread the word with colleagues. If they are really struggling with getting responses and replies from departments, they can raise that with me. That is something they can do.
Yeah, I mean, I'm grateful for that. And I suppose I'd be keen to get a sense of your expectation and the Minister and the Cabinet Office, I suppose, is expectation on the timeliness, but also the quality of the responses that are being received. This can sometimes vary as well, and ultimately for the member who is engaging in that communication, but also the Minister responding and Parliament more broadly, there can be a reputational impact on to constituents, and if there is a sense that response is not quite at the standard that we would expect. So I'm keen to get a sense from you about how your role in ensuring that those expectations, those high expectations, are met.
No, absolutely. Well, look, I have very high expectations, as the first thing to say, perhaps higher, and it's not just my expectations, it's the Prime Minister's and others as well. And I've heard the Prime Minister, reiterating those points to colleagues as well at times. And just to be clear, it does say in the guide to parliamentary work that goes to all ministers, in responding to questions, ministers should follow the principles of the ministerial code, making the utmost effort to give accurate and helpful answers. That is the bar by which people should be judged. And look, we can give people a little bit of slack that there's some kind of newness going on here, and new ministers and new ways of working, a lot of new MPs as well. But really, we should be upholding that, and that's the standard that I hold people to. And I do write to colleagues regularly about these things, and I will continue to do so.
Well, that's very helpful, because that brings me on to my final question to you on this particular subject, which I suppose is the contact, if any, that you have had with individual departments that you have perceived to be particularly poor in responding to individual members, and just to get a sense from you if any discussions have taken place since July.
Yeah, no, they have. I mean, I sent your predecessor committee's sort of last report on the performance of certain departments on PQs and correspondence. I sent that to all cabinet ministers over the summer, I think, reiterating that their job is to respond in a timely and accurate manner and in a good way. And if you've seen that, you'll see which departments are particularly poorly performing, and it's not a case of just volume. I think from memory, the health department was particularly poor, and actually the home department was particularly good. So it's not just a case of volume, because I would probably imagine that the home office actually get a lot more constituency casework type letters from MPs and things than the health department do. So there's real room for improvement there, and I look forward to your next league table, which I will share and do a bit of naming and shaming. But there's also been some incidents, that have been raised with me on the floor of the House and in private. I think there was one case where somebody had tabled a written parliamentary question, and they received an answer that they couldn't give them that information, and then a day or 2 days later, a freedom of information request was then given all of the information that was asked for. Or in fact, even worse, the PQ said there will soon be a freedom of information request that will tell you this answer. And I've reminded colleagues that written parliamentary questions is where you should give the full answer first, not freedom of information requests. Yeah.
Well, that was going to be my very very point. But can you reiterate that members of Parliament shouldn't have to ask freedom of information requests, and that government should give parliamentary written answers priority over freedom of information requests?
Absolutely agree, 100%, and I have made that clear to the person or the department that did not do that, and any other such cases that I receive. I think there's been more than one actually. We will take that up very strongly, and but we've also done a bit more training on that for the parliamentary teams and things as well. Just to really reiterate that point, that written parliamentary questions come first.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lucy. And we can reassure you that this committee will continue to take a very keen interest in written parliamentary questions and keep you with fresh league tables throughout the Parliament.
It'll be interesting reading.
So thank you so much. If there are no further questions, I'm going to draw this afternoon's session to a close. Thank you, colleagues, for your questions, and thank you, Leader of the House, for your time this afternoon and your thorough answers. That concludes today's evidence session. Order.